Wait a minute. I don't remember closing this door. Is today the day? Is this home intruder day? Is this home intruder day? Ooh. Okay, what do I pick? What do I pick? What do I pick? What do I pick? No, those are too long. Can't go with those. Nah, those are gonna take magazines. I don't have any loaded magazines. No, why would I go into a fight with a handgun when I could have a rifle? Ooh, a rifle! Yeah! There we go. That's what's coming with me. All right, guys, Murph's here, and today we're going to be talking about this WZ44 chambered in 7.62 by 5.4. Now, Eagle Eye viewers of the channel will note that I have already reviewed this rifle, so if you're looking for an in-depth, nitty-gritty breakdown of all the details and history and all that kind of stuff of this particular rifle like I do on the channel, then you should go ahead and check the link in the description. This is going to be more of a walk down memory lane. I have a significant amount of personal history with this rifle that actually kind of set me on the path that I am today. We can kind of credit this rifle as being a stepping stone to me actually starting a YouTube channel. And that's what we're going to discuss here today. Kind of like I did in the Ruger Mini14 video, but we're really centering a lot on my development as a shooter and how this rifle influenced that. So with that, why don't we go ahead and get into it? So it's 2009. I'm 19 years old. I had moved out of the house, living somewhat on my own, down in Florida. And at the time, I owned a Ruger 1022 and a Remington 870 Express. Both weapon systems previously reviewed on the channel, link in the description. And I really wanted a centerfire rifle so that I could hunt deer with my friends. So I grew up in Ohio, where if you're gonna hunt deer, you had to do it with a bow, or if you're gonna use gun, you had to use either primitive gun, muzzle loaders, black powder in general, or slug guns. Those were your options. So I was finally living in a state where I could actually hunt with a centerfire rifle. I wanted a centerfire rifle. I was always interested in being able to hunt with a rifle. So I set out to find one. Now, at the time, I was absolutely convinced that I needed a .30 caliber cartridge, and a lot of this has to do with how I was raised. So as much as we may not have rifle hunted, my dad still owned rifles. Specifically, he owned an M1 Garand and a Remington Model 760 pump action rifle, both chambered in .30-06, obviously. And my dad was a huge proponent of the .30-06. Great, 30 caliber American cartridge. The .308's okay, but you got so much more case length with the .30-06, so it's clearly the better choice. You can do so much more with that cartridge. Now today, I know better, because I know that the .308 pretty accurately reflects the .30-06's capabilities while being more efficient, and not just like powder burn rate and all that kind of stuff in order to be able to generate the same velocities, but also action size, weight in a magazine, number of rounds that can fit, which are pretty comparable. But when you talk about the amount of weight and space that the rounds take up, the .308 is overall more convenient. And that is something that is frequently discussed by me in some of my .308 videos that I've done. Links in the description. So I was working against that type of bias, and really at that time I wasn't working against the bias at all. I was actually full on into the bias. I wanted a .30-06 as well. So I looked at like a Remington Model 770, and though I was kind of working on a budget at the time, I was being a little frugal, I wasn't that frugal. I have never cared for the fit and finish on the Remington Model 770, and that is why I did not wind up buying one. Now I also came across a Howa 1500, and I was actually pretty impressed with the Howa 1500. I thought that was a fairly decent little rifle. However, though a decent little rifle, the one that I found was chambered in 22-250, and I was not quickly finding one chambered in 30-06. It seems like Howas have become far more prevalent on the market than they were at that time. So at the same time, I was also looking at different military surplus rifles. Now, I grew up interested in World War II, just like a lot of people from my generation. We had video games like Medal of Honor and Call of Duty. We also had movies like Saving Private Ryan and like Windtalkers and stuff like that. There were a lot of things to kind of get you interested in World War II at that time. And so I grew up, reading about all these different rifles and their great deeds and all that kind of stuff. And available to me at the time were Mosin Nagants and Lee Enfields. They were pretty consistently at gun shows. And both of those are 30 caliber cartridges. And in my reading on the 7.62x54 for the Mosin Nagant, I kept making the comparison to the 30-06. Like, oh, well, a 7.62x54 is just, a Russian 30-06. It's just a Russian 30-06. Now, that's something that we discussed in my 7.62x54 cartridge discussion video, link in the description, in which a 7.62x54 really is more like a Russian 308. Like, it more accurately reflects the capabilities of a 308, which I guess ipso facto, based on the previous conversation we had, it is kind of a Russian 30-06, but not really. Especially since, like, with the additional case length, we probably could have gotten more performance type aspects out of the 7.62x54, but it is still kind of a Russian 30-06 in that it still favorably compares to a 308, which is a shortened 30-06 that replicates its overall ballistics. So, like, ipso facto, I'm right, but I'm not type of deal. A little bit of like a rabbit hole there. We'll get back on track here. So one day I showed up at a gun show with a mind to buy a rifle, and there was this rifle sitting on a table in very good shape. The guy had a little bit of a marked up price on it at the time. Now, keep in mind, we're not quite in the age where you could pick up Mosin Nagants for like $100. That had passed us by, and the rifles were starting to appreciate. This was probably a little high for the time period. I still wound up picking this up for under $150, but most people now would tell me like, oh, well, you paid too much for that rifle, blah, 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 blah. A lot of that has to do with the fact that people seem to be stuck in the past when it comes to pricing, and they need to get over it. Everything appreciates eventually. These rifles aren't, now I've talked about this many times, these rifles are no longer coming into the country. No one is importing these except in very small batches randomly. They're not coming in hand over fist like they were when we still had like open relations with the Russians and stuff like that. That's definitely not changing anytime soon. So there's no expectation that we're ever going to see $100 a rifle Mosin Nagants. And no amount of backlash on the purchasing public is going to change that. There are fewer and fewer of these rifles out there every day, be it from home fires or Bubba cutting them up in his garage, or, any number of ways that these things wind up disappearing, seized by police, whatever. There are fewer and fewer of these every day. These rifles will only appreciate. And I can tell you right now that if I put this out there at the same amount of money that this was originally listed for, around, over $150, it would disappear like that into somebody's collection. So it's kind of one of those things where like people who say, well, you should just like, you should stop buying them so that the prices go down, are people who probably already have the rifles or don't really have an interest in the rifles to begin with. So I picked this bad boy up, and I also had to kind of reevaluate my relationship with ammunition a little bit. So originally, when I started off on my firearms journey, I wanted to have things in mainstream cartridges. That's why I had a 22 long rifle. That's why I had a 12 gauge. And the intention of going with, 9mm 45, 30-06, all those types of things, so that the ammunition would always be readily available. Now, at the time, 7.62x54 was extremely available, and I could easily pick up $5 a paper wrap bundle of 20 7.62x54, and I bought all kinds of 7.62x54. I bought 203 grain soft points, 180 and 174 grain soft points, a ton of FMJs from any number of surplus outfitters, and Wolf, Brown Bear, Silver Bear, all those different types of importers and manufacturers of ammunition. I was buying up the ammunition left and right. And still sitting on a pretty hefty stockpile of that ammo. Now, something that this rifle started to confront me with is that I did not necessarily have the knowledge I thought I had in firearms. And this might be surprising, especially for anybody who's known me for a really long time. When I was a kid growing up, I read all kinds of firearms stuff. I read books, I read magazine articles. I still have many of them on my shelves here today. Pricing guides, the whole shebang. I immersed myself in firearms culture. But a lot of my knowledge was very much so technical. So I could tell you production dates, I could tell you capacities and chamberings and rates of fire and weights and, you know, a few anecdotal stories and little tidbits of information and all that kind of stuff. But my information, my knowledge was not so much hands-on. And I grew up shooting a wide variety of firearms. But when it came to rifles, and also handguns, I really showed where I had some limitations, especially when you start to get into like a tactical sense or something along those lines. I hunted a lot as a kid with shotguns, primarily be it slugs for deer hunting, or also I did a lot of upland bird and stuff like that. So I had a lot of knowledge when it came to like shooting at moving targets with a shotgun and all that kind of stuff. But when it came to rifle marksmanship, I had a very basic understanding. Like, we didn't spend a lot of time zeroing iron sights when I was a kid. If a rifle didn't have a scope on it, we just Kentucky windaged that thing onto paper at 100 yards and called it good. And like all of our shooting was 100 yards. We didn't shoot any closer, we didn't shoot any further. And we definitely didn't shoot anything tactical or anything along those lines. It's the same type of thing in my handgun knowledge. Like, I shot handguns, but I didn't have a good understanding of handgun marksmanship. It wasn't until I got into my professional life where I started to learn rifle marksmanship fundamentals, and I started learning how to zero iron sights and all that kind of stuff. Now, I never went out and got a sight adjustment tool for this rifle. So as a kid, or as a young man, I sat there trying to get this thing on paper at 100 yards, and I was eternally frustrated. I started to become concerned that like the bore was, you know, hogged out or something like that. I did some field expedient bore tests as well as inspections, and the bore on this was fine. Completely fine. It was more of an issue with the shooter. Now, the range that I was shooting at the time, I guess I was having difficulty being able to read my impacts. We're talking Florida, so there was heavy vegetation and then also a lot of sand. You would think the sand would give me a really good feedback, but I think the vegetation was concealing a lot of my impacts, if I think back far enough at the time, which has been years since I shot at that range, like 15 years. So maybe not the best testament to what it is that was going on that time, trying to sit here and just like think about it and remember and all that kind of stuff. But it really started to show me that I had a lot to learn when it came to the practical application of firearms. And guys, I have always had an interest in contextual type things. What I really needed to do was spend more time, not just on introspection, because I've always been a fairly introspective person to begin with, but I also had to start pushing the envelope on where I was acquiring knowledge. So instead of just getting all of my information from my dad and my uncle, I needed to pursue new ideas. And this is kind of one of the issues that I have with a lot of like print media and then also some social media personalities as well. There are a lot of people out there, be it in print or video format, that do not espouse actual opinions. They, at best, will regurgitate industry talking points or maybe a common trend or something along those lines, but they don't actually give you a real opinion. They don't actually put anything to test, and they don't actually tell you whether or not something is working or when and where something might actually work out for you. Like, there's a severe lack of context in a lot of this media because nobody wants to criticize something. And I'm not necessarily saying that you have to criticize everything. Everything has a time and a place. But just as everything has a time and a place, many things do not work well in certain circumstances and situations. And you have to take that into context as well. You have to make sure that you're putting out that information so that somebody isn't trying to Kentucky windage a Mosin Nagant onto paper at 100 yards. Now, these are my biases, these are things that I encountered, but I'm willing to bet that I'm not the only one who's learned all of their firearms knowledge from their dad, their uncle, their grandfather, their best friend, or something along those lines. And I encourage you guys to push your own envelopes, to try new things, and to seek out dissenting opinions and discern whether or not something's actually working out for you. So another example of this would be the bayonet. Okay. Well, there's this big discussion that, well, Mosin Nagants are zero with the bayonet, so if you put the bayonet out there, it'll make the gun more accurate. That doesn't make any sense. or it'll get the rifle closer to its original zero. That also doesn't make any sense because the reality of the matter is that this rifle was zeroed by somebody else. So there's a good possibility that though our eyesight and build and all that kind of stuff, all the things that are going to potentially impact my ability to be able to shoot this rifle well, are going to be hampered if that guy was, 5'2" and I'm 5'10", and he had really short arms and I have very long arms, and then, our difference in how it is that we perceive the sights and all that kind of stuff makes our zeros potentially very different. That's a lot of contextual things to impact that. So it's incumbent upon me, regardless of the presence or absence of a bayonet, to zero these sights, and then I can decide if I want to have them zeroed to the bayonet. The bayonet's not going to make this rifle any more accurate. That's not how accuracy works at all. It is my choice to decide whether or not I want to have the bayonet attached whenever it is that I conduct zero, or if I want to have the bayonet folded or removed entirely, or whatever it is that I have going on. Now, I do wish that I had this rifle when I was living in Germany. This would have been a fantastic hunting rifle in Germany. As it stands, I've done absolutely no actual hunting with this rifle, but maybe someday I will fix that. So for Germany specifically, you generally don't have shots over 180 yards, like at most. Like that's a long shot in that country. So these iron sights would be just fine for any of the normal shooting distances that you would engage in Germany. In addition to that, you also have this bayonet. Bayonets and knives are a huge portion of German hunting culture, because if you have a wounded animal that is being tracked and pinned by dogs, you don't necessarily want to go in there guns a-blazing. You might accidentally shoot somebody's tracking dog, and they're going to be pretty upset about that. So that's where the bayonet or a very large knife comes in handy. I would like to have a little bit of standoff from a pig. So having this bayonet would be pretty great. And I actually remember I was on a drive hunt where I saw a fella carrying a Mosin Nagant WZ44 carbine, and that was his whole purpose, especially since he was one of the shooters in the push line, or in the drive line, I guess I should say. So really he wasn't supposed to be shooting anyway, unless he really had to, but it was advantageous for him to be able to convert his rifle into a spear at that point, so that if he needed to, if he had to dispatch a wounded animal, he could go ahead and do it. All right, now here recently, guys, I've of course been shooting this rifle. I have shot this rifle for many, many years now, off and on. And I actually recently induced a malfunction on it, which is kind of crazy. So I have stripper clips for a lot of my surplus rifles. These are from China, which you guys would have seen these used quite a bit in my military surplus rifle shooting challenge that I put out on the video, like, I don't know, 2 years ago. I'll put a link in the description if you guys are interested in that. But these are very sharp. Like the corners of the strip clip and all that kind of stuff are very sharp. So when it comes to, all of them fit very well either. So you kind of have to, especially once they have like rounds in them, you kind of have to be pretty, like put a lot of pressure on them and stuff like that. I'm afraid of like cutting up my hands on these things because they are that kind of sharp. Normally I would wear a glove. In this instance I was not, so I got it finally lined in there, pushed the ammunition in, and my cartridge casing, well, the top cartridge didn't get pushed all the way in, and it wound up lodged in the feed lips of this magazine. So when I went to close the bolt, it jammed the nose of the cartridge into, or the nose of the projectile into the chamber, but not like into the chamber, so like just below it, and then it was wedged into the feed lips. So I had to actually open my magazine, drop out all the excess ammunition, and then get in there with a multi-tool in order to be able to actually extract that round. Really? That's the only real malfunction I've ever had on this rifle. I've had some issues with like rim lock, but they didn't actually result in rim lock because Mosin Nagants are equipped with an interrupter to assist with that. So I did have some cartridge case, like the case rim overlap and stuff like that, but I was able to power through it with the bolt. Now, that little intro at the beginning is actually based off of recent events. So I was going around the house doing some like chores and stuff like that. I went upstairs and my bedroom door was closed. And I never close my bedroom door because I have a cat and I want to make sure that she doesn't get locked in a room and that doesn't have access to, like, you know, her kitty litter or her water or anything along those lines. And then I also not the best at hearing, you know, especially since I have hearing aids and I generally have music or YouTube going on my hearing aids. So I wouldn't hear her meowing for a while unless I like noticed the cat was gone and went looking for her. Anyway, back on track. So I walk upstairs, I see my bedroom door is closed and I'm like, I didn't do that. Did I do that? Better be safe than sorry because I also have firearms in my bedroom. So if somehow somebody snuck into the house and managed to get all the way to my bedroom, they would be armed, potentially. So I went into my gun room and I ran into an uncomfortable situation where I'm like, oh man, I've got all these guns and I don't know which one to grab. You know, and I looked at like my sporting shotguns. I'm like, no, those are too long. No, those are too long. And I looked at my ARs and I'm like, nah, I'd have to load up magazines. That's going to take too long. Looked at my handguns. I was like, but you know, I could fight with a long gun instead of a handgun. Why don't we do that? And then I wound up grabbing this because it's short and handy and chambered in a rifle cartridge and all that kind of stuff. And I wound up doing a little bit of room clearing with a Mosin Nagant, probably the only person to have done that in quite a while. Now, guys, I think that pretty much covers this little walk down memory lane. I hope you guys found this interesting, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.